That creepy bird mask filled with flowers and spices? It did absolutely nothing to stop the plague. And the doctors wearing them? Most of them had no idea what they were doing. But here's the twist. Their story is way more fascinating than the myths. You've seen the image. The long black robe, the leather gloves, and that haunting beaked mask that looks like something out of a horror movie. Plague doctors have become this iconic symbol of death and disease, showing up in everything from video games to Halloween costumes. But here's what nobody tells you. Almost everything you think you know about plague doctors is wrong. They weren't heroes rushing into danger to save lives. They weren't brilliant medical minds fighting against the unknown. And they definitely weren't curing anyone. So what were they actually doing? What was their real job? And why on earth were they dressed like nightmare birds? Today, we're separating myth from reality. We're diving into museum records, historical documents, and first-hand accounts to uncover what plague doctors actually did during one of history's deadliest pandemics. And trust me, the truth is way more interesting than the legend. Because here's the thing, the plague doctor's story isn't just about the past. It's about how we respond to disease, how we cling to wrong ideas, and how sometimes the simplest solutions are the ones we ignore. Let's start by busting some myths. Okay, so picture this. It's 1656, and you're living in Rome. The plague has hit your city, and people are dying by the hundreds every day. You're terrified. Your neighbors are getting sick. Bodies are piling up in the streets. And then you see him, a figure in a long black cloak, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and that distinctive beaked mask. He's carrying a wooden cane, using it to examine patients without touching them. This is a plague doctor. Now, in the movies or in popular culture, this is where the heroic medical professional swoops in, uses his extensive knowledge, and saves the day, right? Wrong. So wrong. Here's the reality that's gonna blow your mind. Most plague doctors weren't even real doctors. They were whoever the city could hire when everyone else had fled or died. Let me explain. When a plague outbreak hit a city, the first thing that happened was that all the wealthy people, including the good doctors, would pack up and leave. They'd head to their country estates and wait it out. Can't really blame them, right? This disease was killing like 60 of the people who caught it. But cities still needed someone to deal with the crisis. Someone had to verify plague cases, record deaths, treat the poor who couldn't leave, and perform autopsies. Someone had to do the nightmare job that nobody wanted. Enter the plague doctor. These weren't your top-tier medical minds. These were often second-rate physicians, medical students, or sometimes just random people who needed money badly enough to risk their lives. In some cases, cities literally hired fruit sellers or people with no medical training whatsoever. In 1348, one town hired a plague doctor who admitted he'd never even studied medicine. His qualification: he was willing to do the job. That's myth number one shattered. Plague doctors weren't elite medical warriors. They were basically whoever was desperate or brave enough to take the contract. But wait, if they weren't highly trained doctors, what were they actually hired to do? Let's talk about the actual job description, because this is where it gets really interesting. If you visit the Deutsches Medizinhistorisches Museum in Germany, you can see actual plague doctor contracts from the 17th century. These documents spell out exactly what cities expected from their plague doctors. And here's the surprising part. Treating patients was often the least important part of the job. The primary duty of a plague doctor was bureaucratic. Yeah, you heard that right. They were essentially death accountants with a scary costume. Their main job was to verify plague cases and record deaths. When someone died, the plague doctor would show up, examine the body, and officially declare whether it was the plague or something else. This was crucial because cities needed accurate counts to track the outbreak and make decisions about quarantines. They'd also perform autopsies, cutting open corpses to examine the buboes, those horrific swollen lymph nodes that were the plague's signature. Museums like the Museum of London have preserved medical instruments from this era, including the specialized knives plague doctors used for these procedures. But here's where it gets darker. Plague doctors were also responsible for treating the poor, not because they were particularly good at it, but because the poor couldn't afford to leave the city or hire private physicians. The wealthy, they'd already fled or had their own doctors. The plague doctor's patients were the desperate, the abandoned, and the dying. And what kind of treatment did they offer? Well, we'll get to that nightmare in a minute. But first, let's talk about the perks of the job. Because yeah, there were actually some benefits to being a plague doctor. Cities would offer these doctors special contracts. In Venice, plague doctors were given a salary of about 50 ducats per month. That's roughly 5,000 in today's money. Not bad for the 17th century. They also got legal protections. Plague doctors could perform autopsies without fear of prosecution, which was normally forbidden. They could enter any house, quarantined or not. They had special privileges that put them above normal laws. Some even got free housing and food. The city of Orvieto in 1348 offered their plague doctor free room and board, plus immunity from all taxes. Why such good benefits? Because it was a death sentence of a job and cities were desperate. Here's something most people don't know. Plague doctors had a shockingly high survival rate. You'd think they'd be dropping like flies, right? But many of them survived multiple outbreaks. Was it the protective gear? Not really. We'll debunk that myth next. It was probably a combination of previous exposure giving them some immunity, and the fact that they were careful not to spend too much time with patients. Remember, their main job was recording deaths, not providing hands-on care. A plague doctor named Nostradamus, yes, that Nostradamus worked during multiple plague outbreaks in the 1500s and survived. His secret? He didn't actually get very close to patients. He'd prescribe treatments from a distance and move on. So the job reality? Plague doctors were municipal contractors hired to document the plague, perform autopsies, and provide minimal treatment to the poor. They weren't miracle workers. They were record keepers with a terrifying dress code. But speaking of that dress code, let's talk about the costume. Because this is where myth and reality get really twisted. That iconic beaked mask. It's the first thing you think of when you hear plague doctor, right? It's creepy, it's unsettling, and it's become this symbol of the plague itself. But here's what nobody tells you. That costume wasn't even invented until the plague had been around for almost 300 years. The bubonic plague first hit Europe in 1347. The beaked costume? That was invented in 1619 by a French physician named Charles Delorme. That's nearly 3 centuries of plague doctors working without the iconic outfit. So what changed? Why did someone suddenly decide that doctors needed to dress like scary birds? The answer lies in a completely wrong but fascinating medical theory. Delorme designed the costume based on miasma theory, the idea that diseases were caused by bad air. According to this theory, the plague spread through poisonous vapors that rose from rotting matter, sewage, and dead bodies. And honestly, if you were living in a 17th century city during a plague outbreak, this theory would make perfect sense. The smell would be absolutely horrific. Everywhere the plague struck, there was this overwhelming stench of death and decay. So doctors thought, if the plague is caused by bad air, we need to protect ourselves from breathing it. Enter the beak. That long, bird-like protrusion wasn't just for show. It was actually a primitive gas mask filled with aromatic substances. If you could examine a plague doctor's mask at the Museo Storico Nazionale dell'Arte Sanitaria in Rome, you'd see that the beak had 2 small nostril holes and was packed with all sorts of stuff. What did they put in there? Dried flowers, rose petals, camphor, cloves, laudanum, myrrh, mint leaves, and sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges. The idea was that these pleasant, strong scents would overpower the bad air and protect the doctor from infection. Did it work? No, not even a little bit. The plague is caused by bacteria called Yersinia pestis, spread by flea bites and person-to-person contact through respiratory droplets. Smelling flowers doesn't do anything to stop bacteria. But here's the fascinating part. The costume might have actually helped, just not for the reasons they thought. That thick leather coat probably prevented some flea bites. The gloves? They reduced direct contact with infected patients. The wooden cane they carried? It let them examine patients without touching them. So the costume accidentally provided some protection, but the beak itself, the most iconic part, was completely useless. The Museum of London has a preserved plague doctor's cane on display, and it's this long wooden stick with a pointer on the end. Doctors would use it to lift blankets, point at buboes, and keep their distance from patients. It's like the 17th century version of a selfie stick, except way more morbid. The full costume also included a wide-brimmed leather or waxed canvas hat. Why? Because they thought bad air descended from above, so you needed a hat to deflect it. Again, completely wrong, but the logic was consistent with their theory. They wore a long, waxed overcoat that went down to their ankles. This was supposed to prevent the bad air from touching their skin. In reality, it probably just made them sweat like crazy. And they covered their eyes with glass or crystal lenses. Not exactly protective goggles, but it kept fluids from splashing directly into their eyes, which actually would have helped prevent infection. So here's the irony. The parts of the costume that were based on wrong science accidentally provided some protection. But the beak, the part everyone remembers, did absolutely nothing except make them look terrifying. Which honestly might have been useful. Can you imagine seeing that thing walking toward your house? People would probably avoid plague doctors out of sheer fear, which would actually help with social distancing. But let's get to the really horrifying part. What happened when a plague doctor showed up to treat you? Okay, so you're lying in bed, burning with fever. You've got these huge, painful swellings in your neck and groin, the buboes. You're probably going to die. Like, there's a 60 to 80 chance you won't survive this. And then the plague doctor shows up. He doesn't touch you directly. He pokes at you with his cane, examines your buboes from a distance, and then prescribes treatment. What kind of treatment? Well, this is where we need to understand the absolutely bonkers medical theory that guided everything plague doctors did. Welcome to the world of humoral medicine. This is important, so stay with me. because understanding humoral medicine is the key to understanding why plague doctors did such horrifying things to their patients. The theory goes back to ancient Greece, to physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. They believed that the human body contained 4 fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with an element and specific qualities. Blood was air, hot and moist. Yellow bile was fire, hot and dry. Black bile was earth, cold and dry. Phlegm was water, cold and moist. According to this theory, health was all about balance. If your humors were in harmony, you were healthy. If they got out of balance, you got sick. Different diseases were caused by different imbalances. Too much blood? You'd be feverish and energetic. Too much phlegm? You'd be sluggish and pale. Too much yellow bile? You'd be angry and jaundiced. Too much black bile? You'd be depressed and melancholic. The plague, with its fever and those horrific buboes, was obviously a case of severe imbalance. Plague doctors thought all that poison was trapped inside the body, building up pressure and causing those swellings. So how do you restore balance? How do you get rid of excess humors? You get them out of the body, by any means necessary. Let's talk about bloodletting. This was the go-to treatment for almost everything, and plague doctors used it constantly. The idea was simple. If you have too much bad blood, you drain some out. Problem solved, right? They'd use lancets, small blades you can see in museum collections, to cut open veins, usually in the arm. They'd let the blood drain into a bowl until the patient started feeling faint. How much blood? Sometimes a pint. Sometimes more. They'd keep bleeding you until you literally couldn't sit up anymore. Now remember, you're already dying from plague. You're dehydrated, feverish, weak, and now someone's draining your blood supply. This didn't help. It made things worse. Way worse. But plague doctors were absolutely convinced it worked. They'd been taught this method for centuries. Every medical text said bloodletting restored balance. So they kept doing it even as patients died. Then there was purging. If bad humors could come out through blood, they could also come out through, well, other exits. Plague doctors would prescribe powerful laxatives to make patients evacuate their bowels. They'd give emetics to make them vomit. The goal was to expel the poison from every possible opening. Can you imagine? You're already sick, probably dehydrated, and now you're vomiting and having diarrhea for hours. It's hard to think of a worse treatment for someone who's already critically ill. But wait, there's more. For those buboes, those painful swellings, plague doctors had special treatments. And this is where it gets truly horrific. Some doctors would try to draw out the poison by applying live animals to the buboes. I'm not kidding. They'd cut open a live chicken or pigeon and strap it to the swelling, believing the animal would absorb the evil humors. Other doctors would lance the buboes, cut them open with a blade, to let the poison drain out. This was actually one of the few treatments that occasionally helped, because it reduced pressure and drained some of the infected material. But they were doing it for the wrong reasons and often caused secondary infections. Then there were the poultices. Plague doctors would mix up these concoctions of herbs, minerals, and sometimes truly bizarre ingredients, then apply them directly to the buboes. What kind of ingredients? Oh, just things like crushed emeralds and pearls for the wealthy, powdered unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, dried toad, ground up snake meat, mercury, arsenic, and human feces. Yes, you read that right. Some plague doctor recipes called for human excrement. The logic was that fighting poison with poison would restore balance. Museums across Europe have preserved plague doctor recipe books, and reading them is like diving into a nightmare. The Wellcome Collection in London has several, and they're filled with treatments that range from useless to actively deadly. One recipe calls for a theriac, a cure-all potion, made from over 60 ingredients, including opium, viper flesh, and various spices. It probably made patients feel better temporarily because of the opium, but it did nothing to cure the plague. Another treatment involved something called plague water, which was basically brandy infused with herbs. Again, might have made you feel a bit better for a moment, but wasn't curing anything. Some doctors swore by urine therapy. They'd have patients drink their own urine or apply it to the buboes. The theory was that recycling bodily fluids would restore humoral balance. And then there was my personal favorite for sheer absurdity, the transference method. This was the idea that you could transfer the disease to something else. So doctors would tell patients to breathe into the mouth of a young goat or sleep next to a sheep, believing the animal would absorb the plague. Did any of this work? No, absolutely not. The plague is caused by bacteria. It doesn't care about your humoral balance. It doesn't care if you've been bled or purged or had a dead chicken strapped to your armpit. What actually might have helped was rest, hydration, and nutrition. You know, the boring stuff. But plague doctors rarely prescribed that because it didn't fit with humoral theory. The tragic irony? Most plague doctor treatments probably killed people faster than the disease would have on its own. And the plague doctors knew their patients were dying. They saw it every single day. But they didn't question their methods. They just assumed the patients were too far gone, or that they hadn't been bled enough, or that the humoral imbalance was too severe. This is what happens when you have a medical theory that can't be proven wrong. No matter what result you get, you can explain it within the theory. Patient died? The imbalance was too severe. Patient survived? The treatment worked. It's confirmation bias on a massive scale, and it kept medicine stuck in the dark ages for centuries. But here's the question that should be bothering you right now. If none of these treatments worked, what actually did stop the plague? The answer is going to surprise you. While plague doctors were stuffing flowers in their beaks and bleeding patients dry, there was one method that actually worked. One strategy that demonstrably slowed the spread of plague and saved lives. And it had absolutely nothing to do with humoral medicine. Quarantine. Here's the wild part. Quarantine worked so well that we still use the exact same principle today. But in the 17th century, it was considered controversial, extreme, and economically disastrous. Let me paint you a picture of how quarantine actually worked. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quarantagiorni, meaning 40 days. That's how long ships had to wait outside Venice's harbor before they could dock if they were coming from plague-infected areas. This practice started way back in 1377 in Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik. City officials noticed something interesting. The plague seemed to spread when people and goods moved between cities. So they tried an experiment. Any ship or traveler coming from an infected area had to wait on an island outside the city for 40 days. If nobody got sick during that time, they could enter. If someone did get sick, they stayed in isolation until they either recovered or died. And you know what? It worked. Ragusa had significantly fewer plague deaths than neighboring cities. The evidence was clear. Keeping infected people away from healthy people stopped the spread. But here's where it gets complicated. Because quarantine, while effective, was brutal. If someone in your house got the plague, the authorities would board up your door. The entire household would be locked inside, sick and healthy people together. You'd be trapped with your dying family members for 40 days. A guard would be posted outside to make sure nobody left. Food would be passed through a window, and you'd just have to wait and see who survived. Can you imagine? You're healthy, but your spouse has the plague, and now you're locked in a house with them for over a month. The chances of you catching it are huge. The Museum of London has preserved wooden boards that were used to seal plague houses. They're marked with a red cross and the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Seeing them in person is chilling. This approach saved the community, but it was a death sentence for individual families. Healthy people were essentially sacrificed to prevent spread. Cities also enforced mass quarantines. Entire neighborhoods would be cordoned off. Markets would be shut down. Public gatherings were banned. In 1665, during the Great Plague of London, authorities ordered all entertainment venues closed. Theaters, taverns, sports events, all banned. They even killed all the dogs and cats in the city because they thought animals might spread the disease. Fun fact, killing the cats was actually a terrible idea because cats hunted the rats that carried the plague-infected fleas. This probably made the outbreak worse. Oops. The economic impact was devastating. Trade stopped. Businesses collapsed. People couldn't work. The social fabric fell apart. So you had this tension. Plague doctors with their fancy costumes and their humoral theory were doing treatments that felt like action. They were actively fighting the disease. They gave people hope. Quarantine, on the other hand, meant doing nothing. Just waiting. Just isolating. Felt passive and hopeless. But quarantine was the thing that actually worked. Think about the irony here. Plague doctors had all this elaborate medical theory, all these complex treatments, all this specialized equipment. And none of it helped. Meanwhile, the solution was simple. Keep sick people away from healthy people. That's it. No fancy theory needed. No special equipment. Just basic isolation. But because it didn't fit with humoral medicine, because it didn't involve actively balancing the humors, many plague doctors actually opposed strict quarantine measures. Some doctors argued that quarantine was cruel and unnecessary. They said their treatments could cure the plague if given early enough. They convinced city officials to ease quarantine restrictions. And when they did, the plague would surge again. This happened over and over throughout the 17th century. Cities would implement strict quarantine, the plague would slow down. Doctors would say it was their treatments that worked, restrictions would be lifted, and the plague would roar back. It's frustrating to read about, honestly, because the evidence was right there. Cities with strict quarantine had fewer deaths. Cities that relied on plague doctor treatments got devastated. But the medical establishment couldn't admit that their elaborate theories were wrong and the solution was simple isolation. There's a lesson here that's uncomfortably relevant even today. Sometimes the unsexy, simple solution is the right one. Sometimes doing less is more effective than doing more. Sometimes the experts are wrong and the obvious answer is correct. Quarantine eventually did become standard practice, and it's why we still use isolation and social distancing during disease outbreaks today. But it took centuries for medical science to fully embrace it. The plague doctors? They kept insisting their treatments worked, right up until the plague finally burned itself out in Europe in the 18th century. So if their treatments didn't work, and quarantine was the real solution, what's the legacy of plague doctors? Why do we still remember them? And what can we actually learn from their story? Here's the thing about plague doctors. They've become more famous after the plague than they ever were during it. That iconic costume, that creepy bird mask, it's everywhere now. Video games, movies, comic books, tattoos. There's even a craft beer called Plague Doctor IPA. But why? Why has this image endured when we've forgotten so many other aspects of medical history? I think it's because the plague doctor represents something deeper than just historical medicine. It's a symbol of humanity's relationship with death and disease. That costume is unsettling because it's both human and inhuman. To someone trying to help, but looking like a monster. It's the personification of disease and the attempt to fight it, all wrapped into one creepy package. The mask hides the doctor's humanity, turning them into this otherworldly figure. And maybe that's what we needed during the plague, to transform the people dealing with mass death into something less human, something that could bear the unbearable. Museums have picked up on this fascination. The plague doctor has become one of the most popular exhibits wherever the costume is displayed. The Museo Storico Nazionale in Rome has an entire room dedicated to plague history, and the costume is always the most photographed item. But beyond the aesthetic fascination, I think the plague doctor's story holds some crucial lessons for us today. Lesson 1. Confidence isn't the same as correctness. Plague doctors were absolutely convinced they knew what they were doing. They had centuries of medical tradition backing them up. They had elaborate theories and specialized equipment. They had fancy titles and social authority. And they were completely wrong. The treatments didn't work. The theory was nonsense. But their confidence never wavered. This is a pattern we see throughout history, experts being confidently wrong because they're working from a flawed framework. It's not that they were stupid or evil. They genuinely believed humoral medicine was correct. The lesson? Question assumptions. Demand evidence. Be skeptical of complex solutions when simple ones might work better. Lesson 2. Good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. Most plague doctors genuinely wanted to help. They risked their lives showing up to plague houses day after day. Some of them died from the disease themselves, but their good intentions, combined with wrong information, led to treatments that probably killed more people than they saved. In medicine, in policy, in life, it's not enough to mean well. You have to actually check if your interventions are working. You have to be willing to abandon methods that don't produce results, no matter how traditional or respected they are. Lesson 3. The simplest explanation is often correct. Quarantine worked because the principle was simple. Keep sick people away from healthy people. You didn't need to understand germ theory or bacteria. You just needed to observe that the plague spread through contact. Meanwhile, humoral medicine was this incredibly complex, elaborate system with multiple moving parts. And it was wrong. We have a tendency to think that complicated problems require complicated solutions. Sometimes they do. But sometimes the answer is embarrassingly simple, and we reject it because it doesn't feel sophisticated enough. Lesson 4. Legacy isn't always based on effectiveness. The plague doctors failed at their primary mission. They didn't cure the plague. They didn't even slow it down. If anything, some of their treatments made things worse. But they're the ones we remember. Not the city officials who enforced quarantine. Not the nurses who provided basic care. The plague doctors, with their useless costumes and harmful treatments, became the icon. This is because image and narrative are powerful. The plague doctor had a distinctive look and a clear story. That's what sticks in cultural memory, regardless of actual effectiveness. It's a reminder to look beyond the surface, beyond the dramatic image, to ask, what actually worked? Lesson 5. We're not immune to the same mistakes. Here's the uncomfortable part. We look at plague doctors and think, wow, how could they be so wrong? How could they not see that their treatments weren't working? But we're making similar mistakes today. There are accepted medical practices right now that future generations will look back on with horror. There are treatments we're confident in that will turn out to be ineffective or harmful. We're not smarter than our ancestors. We have better tools and more knowledge, but we're just as susceptible to groupthink, confirmation bias, and clinging to outdated theories. The plague doctor's story is a mirror. It shows us what happens when medicine becomes more about tradition than evidence, more about theory than results. And it reminds us to stay humble, stay curious, and always ask, is this actually working? So if plague doctors weren't the heroes of the plague, who was? Let me tell you about some people you've probably never heard of. There were the nurses and caregivers, mostly women, who provided basic comfort care to the dying. They didn't have fancy theories or elaborate costumes. They just offered water, food, clean bedding, and compassion. Did they cure anyone? No. But they made people's final days more bearable. And honestly, that mattered more than any of the plague doctor's useless treatments. There were the city officials who enforced quarantine despite massive public resistance. These people made incredibly unpopular decisions knowing they'd be hated for it because it was the right thing to do. In Milan in 1630, health officials implemented such strict quarantine measures that there were riots. People were furious about being locked in their homes. But Milan's death rate was significantly lower than cities with lax enforcement. Those officials don't have iconic costumes. There are no cool images of bureaucrats enforcing public health policy. But they saved thousands of lives. There were also the gravediggers and body collectors, the most dangerous job during the plague with the highest death rate. These were often criminals who were forced into the work, or desperately poor people who had no other options. They handled corpses all day, every day, knowing they'd probably get infected. Many of them did die. But without their work, the cities would have been uninhabitable. And then there were the scientists who eventually figured out what was actually happening. In 1894, almost 550 years after the Black Death first hit Europe, a French scientist named Alexander Yersin finally identified the bacterium that causes plague. He named it Yersinia pestis. Suddenly, everything made sense. The buboes were swollen lymph nodes fighting bacterial infection. The fever was the body's immune response. The rapid spread was due to infected fleas jumping from rats to humans. All those centuries of wrong theories vanished in the face of actual evidence. Within a few decades, we had antibiotics. Plague became treatable. What had killed millions now had a cure. But it took letting go of humoral medicine. It took abandoning the elaborate theories and starting from scratch with observation and evidence. That's the real lesson of the plague doctors. Progress required admitting that centuries of accepted wisdom were wrong. So let's come back to where we started. That iconic image of the plague doctor, with the beak mask and the long black robe. Now you know the reality behind the myth. They weren't heroic healers. They were municipal contractors, often untrained, doing a job nobody else wanted. Their main role was recording deaths and performing autopsies, not curing anyone. That famous costume? Invented late in the plague's history, based on completely wrong science and only accidentally protective. Their treatments? Based on humoral medicine, a theory that sounded logical but was totally incorrect. Bloodletting, purging, and bizarre poultices that probably killed more than they saved. The thing that actually worked? Quarantine. Simple, unsexy isolation. Nothing to do with medical theory, just basic observation that keeping sick people away from healthy people stopped the spread. But here's what I find fascinating. Knowing all this doesn't make the plague doctor any less compelling as an image. If anything, it makes it more interesting, because now it's not a symbol of medical heroism. It's a symbol of humanity's struggle with disease when we don't have the tools to fight it. It's a reminder of how we cope with mass death, how we create rituals and costumes and theories to make sense of the senseless. It's a warning about the dangers of confidence without evidence, and a celebration of the simple solutions we often overlook. The next time you see a plague doctor in a movie or a game or a Halloween costume, you'll know the real story. You'll know that behind that scary mask was probably just a regular person, doing a terrifying job, armed with wrong information but trying anyway. And you'll know that the real heroes weren't wearing costumes at all. So what surprised you most about the plague doctors? Was it that most weren't real doctors? That the costume was basically useless? That their treatments probably made things worse? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you learned something new today, hit that subscribe button. We're diving into more medical history, more myths versus reality, and more stories that are way stranger than you'd expect. Because here's the thing, history is full of plague doctors. Full of people who were confidently wrong, who had elaborate theories that didn't work, who became famous for the wrong reasons. Learning to spot them in history and in our own time, that's a skill worth developing. Thanks for watching. Keep questioning. Keep learning. And remember, sometimes the person in the scariest costume isn't the one you should fear. Sometimes the real danger is the wrong idea that everyone believes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go make sure we're not doing any modern equivalents of strapping dead chickens to people's armpits in the name of medicine. Actually, on second thought, don't answer that. See you in the next one.